Ratzon, Parshat Vayeshev 57:81. The limud shebeder refuat kol hacholim ubetocham Tanya bato de Margalit Yosef Yair ben Aviv Achava Harav Sivan ben Sima betoch kol shar cholei Yisrael. Bezrat Hashem, with so much excitement, as we could see from this side, the huge beam of light coming in, and from this side, the incredible light that was given to us from Hashem, the Sefer Torah, entering into Chanuka. And we want to connect the Sefer Torah of Parshat Vayeshev to the lights of Chanuka that we'll be lighting, Bezrat Hashem, this Shabbat. For so many of us, the Chanuka candles are very much the same. We light a couple here, a couple there, and we don't realize that there's a huge division within the candles. There's the candles of the night themselves. It's the first night, 1 candle. It's the 7th night, 7 candles. And another one, which is the shamash, that is so different than the Hanukkah candles. The difference between them on a basic level is that the lights of the Hanukkah candle cannot be used. Whereas the whole idea of the shamash is that we use that light. And so we're dividing between 2 types of light, 2 types of vision, maybe in 2 types of lifestyles. Because if we go back into Gan Eden, there are 2 times that Hashem creates light. There's light that he creates on the first day, and there's the sun and the moon, which are also lights that Hashem creates on the 4th day. The incredible difference is, what are they looking at? The light of the first day, there is no world. Hashem didn't create anything yet. So the light is not one that is used, it's one that is. Whereas on the 4th day, the light is to show us, lavdil ben hayom uven halayla, to divide, to separate, to realize that night isn't day and day isn't night, to see the difference between oceans and seas, to understand the difference between grass and trees. And so it's a light that is supposed to be used. And in our Chanukiah, there are both those lights. There's the Hanukkah candles themselves that resemble the light for the sake of light. It can't be used. Whereas there's the other one, the Shamash, which is the 4th night of the creation, which is meant for using. And these are 2 types of candles, 2 types of lights, 2 types of lifestyles, one of being and one of doing. The lights of the Hanukkah candles are being. You're just with them. You look at them. You can't count money next to them. You can't read next to them. They're just light for the sake of light, for the sake of being. Whereas the light of the 4th day is success and movement and growth. And so it's meant to be used. And so that's being and doing, 2 different types of lights. But when we go into Parshat Vayeshev, we are introduced to 2 very different worlds. The world of Yosef and the world of Yehuda. The Ishbitzer Rebbe, the Meshiloach, Moreno Rabbeinu, he teaches us that we have to really recognize that these 2 tribes are 2 different ways that Hashem interacts with the world. One is logical and one is beyond logic. So when we look at the story of Yehuda in this parsha that begins in Perek Lamed Chet, it says, Vayered Yehuda me'et echav. The pasuk describes that Yehuda leaves his brothers. But if we get the context, Yehuda is abandoning his family in a time of great destruction. The pasuk before, Yaakov Avinu tears his clothing and doesn't want to receive any consolation. He's angry and he's upset and he's sad. And the next pasuk, Yehuda abandons his brothers, which is obviously something incredibly questionable. And then he goes down and he sees a woman that's not Jewish, and he marries her. And his children act in ways that are beyond anything we would ever imagine, something that we would hope on anyone, that they're so selfish, and they all get killed. And then his wife passes away of Yehuda, and he's mourning, and he sees who he thought was a prostitute, and he sleeps with her. And so the whole idea here is that Yehuda is falling lower and lower. Like we know from Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam. The Sheva Yipol Tzadik is Yehuda. He's falling so low, things that we can't even imagine. And he sleeps with a woman he thought was a prostitute, and she gives birth to a child named Zerach and Peretz, who later will give birth to David HaMelech, who later will give birth to Mashiach. And we look at the story, and it's a huge anomaly. Yehuda is someone you would never write home about. You would never accept a yeshiva. You would throw him out the streets. You would make sure he doesn't get an aliyah in your minyan. You might even yell at him if you see him. And yet he's the one that nothing really so bad happens, and out of him comes Mashiach. When we look in contrast to the story of Yosef, he's so respectful of his father. And yes, there's a lot of arguments. Maybe he was a bit full of himself. But there's a beautiful perush that I heard from Morin Rabbeinu Shlomo Katz. Why did he tell his dreams to his brothers? Because he thought that they would realize that what it means to be a brother, what it means to be a friend, is that you're excited about someone else's growth. He didn't realize they weren't ready. And either way, it's not maybe the easiest act to understand. Maybe it is a little bit full of gava, if you want to read it that way, not like Shlomo Katz. But at the end of the day, the reality is that he doesn't do something so bad. Next pasuk, thrown into a pit, loses his family, loses his father, loses his dreams, thrown into a pit, into Egypt. And it's just so next to each other and so difficult. Yehuda does so many bad things, and yeah, Mashiach is born. And Yosef is so medayik. Eshed Potiphar wants to sleep with him, he throws her out. So different than Yehuda, who goes to a prostitute. We know the story of Yehuda, that he gives his clothing, and the clothing of Yosef are torn off of him. And yet the reality is that Yehuda, the story is so simple. Mashiach is born. And Yosef is such a tzaddik, protecting himself, doing everything right. And he gets punished all the time. And adds to this, the Mei Shiloach at the end of the Parsha, we have the dreams of Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Ophim that have very, very similar dreams. And similar to Yehuda and Yosef, one of them is saved and comes out to life, and he's serving the king. And the other one is cast to death and thrown out the door and killed. And when Yosef hears this story, he realizes it's the same story of Yehuda and Yosef. That's why these dreams are so important for us to understand, because they're presenting to us two different ways that God interacts with the world. That's what Hashem is saying to Yosef in the pit. That there's one way called Hanagat HaMishpat. That Hashem interacts with the world in a way that's logical, like Yosef. That you make a little bit of a mistake and you fall. But then there's something called beyond logic. That Hashem says it's not bound to your actions. It's beyond your capacity. You can't understand it. Sarah Mashkim, same dream. Whoa, becomes the servant. Yehuda, everything looks seemingly on an external level like it's the wrong way. And yet, boom, Hashem says, not everything is in your capacity. Not everything is in your hands. And so we realize that also with Yehuda and Yosef, we see the two types of lights. There's the shamash, like Yosef. It's a very logical light. It's used to divide, to control, to lead, and it's so important. And you need that shamash, or you cannot light the Chanuka candles. The shamash is saying, we live in a world of achievements, of doing, of growth, of Yosef. That when we make mistakes, things go bad. But what we have to realize is that at the same time that there's regular lights, there's also the lights of Chanuka, which teach us that not everything is bound to our actions. On an active level, Yehuda is not the one you would choose as Mashiach. On an active level, Sarah Hamashkim is not so different than Tzara Ofim. But Hashem is teaching us that He wants to also help us realize not to bound ourselves to our minds. Use our minds, but let yourself go beyond it also. And the bracha, as we look at Parsha Vayeshev in the Sefer Torah, and the lights that we set on the other side of Chanuka, that we realize the combination between Chanuka and Parsha Vayeshev. That in order for us to really understand Chanuka, in order for us to really bring back Mashiach ben Yosef, who will enable us to bring back Mashiach ben David, we need to know the journey of the two levels. Number one is Yom Kippur. You have to measure your actions. You have to do the right things. You have to know what's right and what's wrong. What's the right thing to do and what's the bad thing to do. But don't let yourself get into a trap of thinking that the world is bound to you. There is also unexpected. There are also surprises. There are also dreams that sometimes might be greater than the reality we live in. And as we're looking at our Chanuka candles, we should realize that we first need to have a shamash. That's what we start with. That's the worlds we know. But it's giving us the opportunity to go beyond our limits, to go beyond our limitations, and realize that the Chanuka candles are the true story of redemption, that we're able to live in a state of mind of being. We're not trying to change things. We're trying to receive the realization that believing in Hashem means that dreams are not bound to reality. They enable us to look at reality from a new perspective.